Hey class, this is Mr. Schmidt with the November 5th recap of our ecosystem services and all the cycles summary. All right, so today we're talking about what does wildlife do for us, okay? Students had a number of good answers in terms of providing us food, giving us shelter, cleaning the water, putting oxygen into the air. There's all sorts of different pieces that the environment does for us, and the wildlife plays that role. Okay, so when we're talking about this in environmental science, we're not necessarily talking about some sort of external good, but specifically what it can do for us as humans. Okay, so when we're looking at this, we're looking at the different cycles here. Okay, and this is doing this. All right. And we are trying to look at the how all the cycles come together: carbon cycle, phosphorus cycle, nitrogen cycle, water cycle. I didn't spend very much time on the oxygen cycle because it tends to get very repetitive. The oxygen cycle has a lot to do with the carbon dioxide and nitrogen and water, so it's kind of all mixed together. Phosphorus, however, is unique, so that's why we spent some time on that one. Okay, so students will be able to describe the role nature plays in these services. Okay, so we started off with the carbon cycle. Okay, the majority of carbon is in a reservoir or held in the soil and oceans. Carbon exists in abiotic environment. Okay, abiotic, remember, means no oxygen. Okay, so without oxygen gas, carbon dioxide, CO2 is in the atmosphere. It can then be dissolved into water, into H2O, to form carbonic acid, HCO3. Okay, or carbonate, hydrogen carbonate. Okay, so once we have that carbonate in rocks, okay, then we can get things like calcium carbonate, which is limestone and coral, also very similar to chalk. Okay, and then the other big place carbon can be found in the soil is with fossil fuels, such as coal, petroleum, and natural gas. Okay, these are all derived from once living things millions of years ago, often in the Carboniferous period. Okay, so if we don't want to wait millions of years, we need to think about how, or if we don't want the same environment that was existing millions of years ago, we need to think about how we're going to use coal, petroleum, and natural gas. Okay, and then the other place in the soil where carbon can be found is in dead organic matter. Okay, so if you have dead leaves or a dead animal or something like that, all of that material will get worked back into the soil and will carry the carbon with it. Okay, so this is one picture we saw of the carbon cycle as it goes through the different pieces here, and there's a whole lesson on that. Okay, and so what we see in that picture is that carbon enters biotic, so that's normally with oxygen or living things. Okay, remember bio means living. Okay, so biotic environment through photosynthesis, so that meant the changes in light energy to chemical energy. Okay, so that was the thing we talked about the other day with plants' role in the system. Okay, and then carbon will go back into the atmosphere either by breathing, remember our respiration or plants' aspiration will send back carbon dioxide, or when we die or those leaves die, then that decay will take some of the carbon into the soil, but some of the carbon will also go back into the atmosphere, especially if there's something like mushrooms or mold that will push the carbon back into carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere. Or the other one is burning, whether it's burning leaves or burning fossil fuels or burning wood, that all is going to send carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere. Okay, but we're talking about environmental services here. So carbon affects humans in a number of different ways. First of all, remember the removal of carbon to make plants, all those plants that we eat, all the sugars and all the vegetables and fruits, whether they're things that we eat or that the animals that we eat all have for their meals. Okay, so it is the source for all of this energy. Okay, carbon is also the major player and the major chemical element that makes up sugars, fats, and proteins. So they are all there in all of our food sources. Okay, all right. Also, for everyone who has a gasoline-powered car, okay, it's the carbon cycle is the one driving all those fossil fuels. And my carbon-powered car, my gasoline-powered car. Okay, even if you had like an ethanol car, okay, might be from corn or something like that. That's still a carbon cycle. There's still combustion happening. Okay, and then remember I said sugars, fats, proteins, all those things that are in our cells are also made out of carbon. Okay, pretty much all the different pieces, if you go into any part of biology, there's always going to be carbon. In fact, organic chemistry is the study of carbon and carbon chains, and you can spend years just studying how carbon links together, because carbon has a unique ability not just for two of them to stick together, but to form chains that can be thousands of atoms long. Okay, and that's all based on the carbon. It starts with the carbon dioxide entering through the photosynthesis to become part of the living cycle. Okay, so our next cycle was the nitrogen cycle. Okay, that one, most of the nitrogen is in the air. 79% of the nitrogen reservoir is in the air as N2 gas. Okay, now nitrogen is essential to plants and animals, but interestingly, neither plants nor animals can use nitrogen gas, which means we have to find it in some form that's not nitrogen gas. We have to find some other form of nitrogen, and that is ammonia and nitrates. So in order for us to get the ammonia and nitrates, there has to be something that takes that N2 and changes it into NH3, ammonia, or NO3, nitrate. Okay, that process is called nitrogen fixation. And the most common ways that we go through this nitrogen fixation process, okay, is blue-green algae, which is in the oceans, okay, and in ponds and rivers and some other places you can find it, okay, or if it's in the soil on Earth, terrestrial soil, okay, then we can see bacteria on the roots of certain plants. They're called nodules of lignums. It's just a fancy way of saying the roots of peas and beans and alfalfa and clover. And if you remember back to our biomes project, I suggested some of those as part of your grasslands ecosystem. If you have beans or clover in your grasslands in your little bottle, then it can take some of that nitrogen out of the air and put it back in the ground, and then the moss and the grass or the any other plants you planted can then use the ammonia and nitrates that were generated off of this bacteria accompanying the beans and the clovers. Okay, and then another source not as prevalent is lightning. As lightning dashes through the air, it's going to turn some of that nitrogen into other compounds as well. Okay, so this gives us another simple picture of the nitrogen cycle. Notice most of it's in the air, but then it passes through the bacteria. It can then go in and out of plants and animals, and then there'll be different bacteria on the far end that take the dead plants and dead animals and eventually release the nitrogen back into the air. Okay, so nitrogen returns to the soil by decomposition. Okay, so those dead things, or it can also be true for when you go to the bathroom. Okay, all that dead matter, those once living things or once living molecules, okay, then the ammonia and the bacteria and the fungus will start pushing it back into the soil. Okay, So exists in soil as the nitrates, nitrites, and ammonia, okay? And then there's gonna be some other, so you have those bacteria on the clovers and beans pulling the nitrogen in and pushing out things like ammonia. And then you'll have a completely different set of bacteria that take the ammonia and push it back out as nitrogen gas, okay? So not only is nitrogen important for our plants and all of our fruits and vegetables to grow, we need nitrogen in our bodies for things like DNA, okay? And DNA is built, and the codes of DNA are passed around by another thing called RNA, and both DNA and RNA require amino acids. So this is all important for the code of life inside your cells, okay? And that is all reliant on the nitrogen. It also has a ton of carbon and some other elements as well, but it's one of the big places we see nitrogen and how important nitrogen is. Okay, then our last cycle we talked about was the phosphorus cycle, okay? So the major reservoir for phosphorus is inside rocks, okay? If we have rocks that have phosphorus and they get in water, then leaching occurs. The water dissolves the phosphate in the rocks and carries it to the lakes and the streams and beyond. This dissolved phosphate is then used by plants and passed through the food chain. So once it's in the water, then it can go up the roots of the trees and the plants. And then when we, or the deer or the cows or whatever, eat the plants, then we get the phosphorus from the plants, okay? And then just like pretty much everything else, hopefully we see pretty much the same answer every time. Once we have the phosphorus inside of us, eventually we go to the bathroom, excretion, pooping, or we die. Either way, all that matter and all that phosphorus contained inside that matter can then go back into the environment, okay? So here we see again another cycle. The rocks come in contact with water. The water pulls the phosphorus out. It's now in the phosphorus is now in the water. It can go up through the roots of the plants. And then anything that eats the plants will get that phosphorus, okay? All right, so if we want to grow plants faster, one of the things we can do is we can dig up some of those rocks that contain phosphorus, okay? And we can turn it into fertilizer, okay? The problem is we have too much fertilizer in the rocks and the soil. Remember, all that phosphorus can get dissolved in water. So when it rains or when there's a flood or the rivers come, it can pull the phosphorus away and wash it downstream. Okay, now, always ending on the last question, what does it do for humans? Okay, phosphorus helps us make bones and teeth, okay? And it helps us process carbohydrates and fats, okay? All things we want to do in order to survive and be healthy. Okay, so that was a recap of the cycles. Hopefully by now you've heard a few times, a few different ways, a few different pictures for all of this, and you have a good idea of how all these things flowing, because next we're going to start looking at different processes within this. So we've looked at how do all these things flow through a system. Then we have the different biomes of what do the systems look like based on their flow, especially things like the water cycle, and how will those affect it, and how will the water cycle carry these other nutrients with them. Okay, so that means for our assignment, we had to take these terms and put them into our worksheet here. When it comes time to do a drawing, I don't want you to cut and paste from here. I want you to look at those assignments or look at those notes, and with your own hand, with a piece of paper, or you could, I saw a couple people used some sort of paint program on their computer. You're going to draw it out using your own hand and then put it in there, okay? So then you can insert a photo or a screenshot of your paint program, okay? And again, it goes through all these. I did have a question on fossil fuels. What are the fossil fuels? Okay, we have them listed right here. coal, oil, natural gas. Okay, there's more, but those are the big ones. Okay. All right, I think that was the most common question I saw for class before we came out of here. All right, so you're going to work your way down again for your drawing by hand, cut and paste it right into here. It should be about that much detail. It should fit on half a page. Okay. All right, so with that, the quarter is now over. We're on to second quarter. Please make sure all your labs continue to be completed and turned in on time. And have a good weekend.